They left her with nothing but a dead man's name and a cabin stripped bare of every last crumb. The wind howled through the cracks in the wooden walls, gnawing at the hem of Clara Evans' torn dress as she crouched by the empty hearth. Her husband's body was still warm when the settlers came. They buried him quick, no prayers, no words, just tossed his bones in the ground and left her with a shovel and a sneer. "He owed us," one of them said, a man with whiskey on his breath and greed in his eyes. "You're lucky we ain't taking you too." Clara didn't speak, didn't cry, just watched them load up her last sack of flour, her last canteen of water, her last bit of hope. By the time they rode off, she was a shadow on the floorboards, staring at the stain where Thomas Evans's blood had soaked into the wood. Night fell like a black shroud, and the silence crept in like a snake through the cracks. Clara shivered, her hands wrapped around her knees, her mind drifting to places she didn't want to go. The wedding. The day Thomas kissed her in the church and said, "Forever." The night he said, "Trust me, we'll make it through this winter." The morning he clutched his chest and fell to the floor, eyes wide, breath gone. Now, all she had was silence, and silence was loud. Then came the first knock. Clara's breath hitched. No one came up this way unless they wanted to take what wasn't theirs. She reached for the knife under the bed, fingers trembling, and moved to the door, pressing her ear against the cold wood. "Who's there?" she called, voice breaking. "You gonna let a man freeze to death out here?" The voice was deep, smooth as whiskey, but not slurred like the settlers. Clara unlatched the door, cracked it open, and there he was, towering, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of wet earth and a hat tipped low over dark, unruly hair. He smelled like horses and smoke and something else she couldn't name. "What do you want?" she whispered. "Ain't what I want," he said, nodding toward the horizon. "It's what you need." Clara stepped back as he moved inside, his boots heavy against the creaking floor. In his arms was a burlap sack, and when he set it down, the scent of coffee and dried meat hit her like a punch. "Who sent you?" she asked, still clutching the knife. "Ain't nobody," he said, shrugging off his coat. "Name's Silas Boone. Got a ranch 3 miles west. Saw the settlers ride off with a wagon full of what wasn't theirs." "Why do you care?" "Don't," he said, meeting her eyes. "But I do know what it looks like when a man gets buried and the woman he left behind gets buried right after." Clara swallowed, throat dry. "I don't need charity." "Good," he said, leaning back against the wall, arms crossed. "'Cause this ain't charity, it's an offer." "Offer? I need a cook, a hand with the horses. You need a roof, food, a chance to live another day." He paused, eyes darkening. "And a man like me could use a wife." The words hung heavy in the air, thicker than the smoke from the dying fire. Clara's grip on the knife tightened. "You think I'm just gonna marry a stranger to survive?" Silas's jaw clenched. "I ain't asking you to love me, just asking you to stay alive." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and somewhere in the distance, wolves howled back. Clara's knees trembled, her heart pounding. Marry a stranger, or die alone, a choice no woman should ever have to make. But in this world, choices weren't gifts. They were ultimatums. And Clara Evans was running out of both. Clara Evans sat at the wooden table, staring down at a plate of beans she couldn't taste. The room was too warm, too still, and Silas Boone sat across from her, chewing slowly, eyes fixed on her like he was trying to read a book without turning the pages. The fire crackled behind them, spitting out embers that danced against the darkened window. Outside, the wind screamed through the canyons, but in here, the silence pressed like a weight against her chest. "Eat," Silas said, his voice low, firm. Clara stabbed a fork into the beans, forced a bite down her throat, the taste like sawdust. "You're not going to hurt me, are you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Silas set his fork down, his jaw tight. "If I wanted to hurt you, you'd know it by now." "Then why'd you bring me here?" "'Cause it's winter. 'Cause you were starving. 'Cause the wolves don't ask questions before they eat." Clara swallowed hard, her eyes dropping to the table. His words were rough, clipped, but they didn't cut like a threat. They cut like a truth. "You said you wanted a wife," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "What does that mean to you?" Silas leaned back, the chair creaking beneath his weight. "It means I get a woman who can cook, clean, keep a house from falling apart. And you get a roof, a bed, food on the table, and a man who won't let anyone touch you without your say-so." "And love?" The word felt foreign in her mouth, as if it belonged to another woman's story. Silas's jaw worked, muscles tensing beneath his beard. "Love don't keep a woman warm at night. Love don't feed a man's belly. Love's a word. Survival's a fact." Clara dropped her fork. It clattered against the tin plate, echoing through the room. "So that's it?" "That's it," he said, voice as flat as the plains outside. "You stay, you work, you eat, you sleep. And when you're ready, we say the words." Clara stood, the room spinning, knees shaking beneath her. "And if I don't say them?" Silas didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at her with eyes as dark as the storm clouds that never passed. "Then you don't. Doors open, roads are empty. But the wolves are always hungry." The fire popped, sending a flare of sparks into the air, and Clara flinched. Her heart pounded against her ribs, and every inch of her skin felt like it was being peeled back by invisible hands. "What happened to your last wife?" she asked, the question sharp as a knife. Silas's gaze didn't falter, but something in his eyes darkened, a shadow passing like a hawk over a field. "She died," he said, voice flat. "How?" "The way most women die," he said, picking up his fork again. "Alone." Clara's throat closed. She grabbed her shawl, wrapping it tight around her shoulders, and moved to the window. Outside, the ranch spread out like a graveyard. Empty, cold, silent. The barn door creaked in the wind. The fence posts leaned like broken teeth. And beyond the fields, the mountains rose like giants, snow-capped and unforgiving. "If I stay," she said, eyes still on the darkness, "what do I get?" Silas's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. His boots echoed as he crossed the room, each step heavier than the last. When he reached her, he stopped, so close, she could feel the heat radiating off his body. "You get to live," he said, voice low and gruff. "You get a man who don't hit, who don't lie, who don't leave you in the dirt to starve like the others did." Clara turned, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt something other than fear. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something stronger than hunger and colder than rage. It was a choice. "Then I stay," she said, voice steady, spine straight. "But don't expect me to forget why I had to." Silas nodded once, jaw tight, and walked away, boots thudding against the wooden floor. The wind outside howled louder, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf answered back. Clara stood in the barn, hands raw from scrubbing the floorboards clean of blood. Silas Boone's horses whinnied and stomped, their dark eyes watching her like she was the ghost of some woman they'd seen buried and forgotten. Outside, the wind whipped through the valley, carrying the scent of pine and smoke, and the kind of cold that made bones ache for days. Clara straightened, wiping her hands on her skirt, and caught sight of her reflection in the water trough, a face she barely recognized. Hollow eyes, cracked lips, a woman who had buried one man and agreed to marry another just to stay alive. "You done in there?" Silas's voice boomed from the doorway, and Clara flinched, her back stiffening. He stood with his arms crossed, eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. "I'm done," she said, voice hard, unyielding. "Then let's go," he said. "I got work for you." They walked in silence to the main house, their boots crunching through the thin layer of snow that had fallen overnight. Inside, the fire roared, and the smell of fresh coffee clawed its way through Clara's empty stomach. She hadn't eaten since yesterday, not since Silas had laid down the rules and the walls had closed in like a prison cell. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the table where a plate of bread and a mug of coffee waited. Clara hesitated. "I thought I was supposed to work." "You don't work on an empty stomach," he said, dropping into the chair across from her. "Eat." Clara sat, hands shaking as she tore the bread apart. Each bite tasted like sand, each swallow scraping down her throat like gravel. She kept her eyes down, fixed on the knot in the wood grain of the table. "I heard you screaming last night," Silas said, voice low, steady. Clara's head snapped up, eyes wide. "I wasn't—" "Don't lie," he said, leaning forward, elbows resting on the table. "You were screaming a name. Thomas." Clara's chest tightened, and the room swayed. "What do you care?" Silas's jaw clenched, the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "I care because the dead don't answer back, and the dead don't keep you warm at night." Clara shoved the chair back, rising to her feet, fists clenched at her sides. "You think you can just replace him? You think because you got money and a ranch and a roof over my head that I'll just forget?" Silas stood too, his height towering over her, his eyes dark and stormy. "I don't want you to forget," he said, voice sharp as a blade. "I want you to remember exactly what it felt like when those settlers left you with nothing, when they took everything from you and rode off without looking back." Clara's breath came in short gasps, her chest heaving. "I'm not your charity case." "No," Silas said, stepping closer, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. "You're my wife." Clara's jaw dropped, the air sucked clean from her lungs. "I didn't agree to that." "You did," he said, voice dropping to a low growl. "When you took my food, when you slept under my roof, when you said you'd stay." Clara's eyes burned, tears stinging the backs of them like acid. "So that's it? You think you own me now?" Silas reached out, his hand catching her chin, forcing her to look up at him. "I don't want to own you, Clara. I want to save you." "From what?" she whispered, voice trembling. "From yourself," he said. "From that grave you keep digging in your head every night." Clara's knees buckled, and she collapsed against him, fists beating weakly against his chest. "I don't want to be saved," she choked out. "I just want to be left alone." Silas wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight as she shook, as the walls fell down around her and the screams she'd been holding in finally escaped. And as her sobs echoed through the empty house, Silas closed his eyes, jaw tight because he knew the truth. The dead don't answer back, and the living, no matter how much they pretend to be strong, are always haunted. The morning light stabbed through the window like a knife, cutting across the room and landing on Clara's eyes. She blinked, wincing, her head pounding from a night of fitful sleep and dreams she couldn't shake. In the corner, Silas Boone sat in a chair, elbows on his knees, head bowed, eyes fixed on the floorboards as if the answers to all his sins were carved into the wood. Clara pushed herself up, the thin blanket falling to her waist, her hair tangled and wild. "Did you watch me all night?" she asked, voice scratchy, raw. Silas didn't look up. "You screamed again." Clara's jaw clenched, fists knotting in the quilt. "I don't remember. You said his name," Silas said, his voice hard as iron. "Thomas." The room hung heavy, the air thick as smoke. Clara swallowed, her throat tight, a lump forming that wouldn't go down. "You don't get to ask me about him." "I ain't askin'," Silas said, finally lifting his gaze, eyes dark and cold. "I'm telling you, you said his name, and you begged him not to leave you." Clara's eyes flared, her spine straightening like a steel rod. "What do you care?" "I don't," Silas said, rising to his full height, boots heavy against the wooden floor. "But I can't keep bringing you back to life if you keep burying yourself in a man who's already dead." Clara threw the blanket off, swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor. "You think I asked for this?" she spat, eyes blazing. "You think I wanted to end up here, a widow in a strange man's house, waiting for the wolves to drag me under?" Silas's jaw ticked, fists clenching at his sides. "I think you're alive, and I think you're too damn scared to remember what that feels like." Clara's breath caught in her throat, and the world tilted, the room spinning as memories crashed over her. Thomas's hand on her cheek, his lips on her brow, the way he'd promised to always come back, the way he didn't. "I can't do this," she whispered, voice breaking. "Then don't," Silas said, taking a step closer, his shadow swallowing hers. "But don't expect me to stand by and watch you die one piece at a time." Clara's eyes locked on his, fury and desperation swirling like a storm. "Why do you care? You don't even know me." Silas's jaw clenched, his eyes dropping to the scar on her wrist, the one she tried to hide beneath her sleeve. "Maybe because I know what it feels like to bury someone and still hear their voice at night." The room fell silent, the wind howling through the cracks in the walls, rattling the windows. Clara's chest heaved, her breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. "I don't want to forget him," she said, voice small, fragile. "Then don't," Silas said, stepping back, the heat between them dissipating like smoke. "But you're still here. And he's not, and one day you're gonna have to choose whether you stay buried with him or start walking again." Clara's hands trembled, her nails digging into her palms until she felt the sting of blood. "And what about you?" she asked, eyes flashing. "You ever start walking again?" Silas's face darkened, his jaw set like granite. "No," he said, voice flat, emotionless. "Because the woman I buried ain't done screaming yet." Clara swallowed, the lump in her throat too thick, too heavy, too real. "I can't be your wife," she said, eyes burning. "Not like this." "Then don't," Silas said, turning away, his back broad and unyielding. "But you better decide what you want to be, Clara Evans, because there's only room for the living in this house, and right now, all I see is a ghost." And with that, he walked out, the door slamming behind him, the sound echoing through the empty house like a gunshot. Clara sat there, the silence pressing in, the ghost of Thomas's voice echoing in her head, the memory of Silas's eyes burning against her skin. And in that moment, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't sure if she was haunting herself or if she was the one being haunted. The rain came down like a fist, pounding the roof of the barn, turning the dirt outside to thick, clinging mud. Clara stood at the window, arms wrapped tight around herself, eyes fixed on the dark shape moving through the storm. Silas Boone hauled a dead calf through the muck, his shirt soaked through, muscles straining as he dragged the carcass toward the shed. Thunder cracked overhead, and Clara flinched, her breath fogging up the glass. She should go out there. She should help him, but her legs wouldn't move, because every time she saw him like that, drenched, wild-eyed, jaw clenched, it was like looking at Thomas, like staring into the face of a ghost she couldn't shake. A flash of lightning lit up the sky, and for a split second, she thought she saw Thomas's face in the mud, eyes open, lips moving, calling her name. "Clara!" The voice was real, and it was coming from outside. Clara snapped out of it, the illusion shattering like glass, and she ran for the door, her bare feet slapping against the cold wooden floor. By the time she made it outside, Silas was leaning against the shed, chest heaving, face ashen. "You okay?" she said, breathless, rain pouring down her face, soaking through her dress. "Damn calf," Silas muttered, wiping rain from his eyes. "Too late. Coyotes got to it first." Clara's gaze dropped to the dead animal, its belly torn open, ribs exposed, guts steaming in the cold. "You need help?" "I need a drink," he said, pushing past her, boots squelching in the mud. Clara followed him inside, shutting the door against the storm, her heart hammering against her ribs. Silas went straight for the cabinet, yanked the bottle down, and poured himself a shot. "That's not gonna help," she said, crossing her arms over her chest, shivering. "What do you care?" he said, tossing back the whiskey, jaw clenched. "I care because you said you weren't that man," she said, voice sharper than she intended. "You said you were different." Silas slammed the glass down so hard it cracked. "I ain't different. I just lie better." Clara took a step back, her spine pressing against the wall, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" Silas said, voice tight, eyes wild. "Pretending you don't care," Clara said, her throat thick. "Pretending you don't see me." "You want me to see you?" Silas said, voice rising, fists clenched. "Fine, I see you. I see a woman who's still buried 6 feet under a man who ain't coming back. I see a woman who screams his name every night and can't say mine once. I see a woman who'd rather freeze to death than let another man touch her." Clara's face flushed, her cheeks burning. "You don't know me." "No," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "I don't, because you don't want to be known." Clara's throat tightened, the air between them electric, suffocating. "You don't know what it's like," she said, her voice cracking. "You don't know what it's like to love someone so much you can't breathe. You don't know what it's like to lose the only person who ever made you feel alive." "You're wrong," Silas said, stepping closer, his face inches from hers. "I know exactly what it's like." Clara's eyes widened, her pulse slamming in her throat, and for a moment, everything fell away. The storm outside, the whiskey glass on the table, the ghost of Thomas Evans hanging in the air like smoke. All she could see was Silas, his eyes dark and haunted, his breath hot against her skin. "Then why are you doing this?" she whispered. "Why are you pushing me away?" Silas's jaw worked, his eyes hard as flint. "Because I don't know how to keep you, and I sure as hell don't know how to let you go." Before she could answer, he turned and walked away, his boots echoing against the wooden floor, the door slamming behind him like a gunshot. Clara stood there, rain dripping from her hair, her heart in her throat, her fists clenched at her sides. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the grief and the fear and the hollow ache that never left, a spark flickered. Because for the first time she realized that maybe she wasn't the only one still haunted. The storm had passed, but the world outside still felt wet and raw, like a wound that hadn't healed. Clara stood in the kitchen, fingers clenched around the handle of a cast-iron skillet, her jaw tight as she stared at the empty doorway. Silas had been gone since dawn. No note, no word, just the echo of that door slamming behind him, like he was trying to shut her out of his life for good. But he wouldn't. Not now, not after the way he'd looked at her last night, eyes dark, jaw tight, his hands shaking like he was holding back 1,000 words he couldn't say. Clara threw the skillet down on the stove, the clang echoing through the empty house. "Damn you," she muttered, tears stinging her eyes. "You don't get to walk away." The words bounced back at her, mocking her, reminding her that she was the one who'd been running since the day Thomas died, the day she watched him gasp for air while the settlers stood around and watched, eyes blank, arms crossed, as if her husband's death was just another inconvenience. Clara wiped her eyes, furious, because the tears weren't for Thomas anymore. They were for herself, for the woman she was becoming. The woman Silas Boone was dragging out of her, whether she wanted to be her or not. A sharp bang from outside snapped her to attention, and Clara grabbed the rifle from the corner, hands steady, eyes cold. The last time she'd held a gun was the day Thomas taught her to shoot, back when they were newlyweds, back when he'd called her his wild rose, and said she'd never need to use it. But that woman was gone, buried 6 feet under the snow beside the man who couldn't keep his promise. Clara crept to the window, eyes scanning the yard. The barn door swung open, banging in the wind. No sign of Silas, no sign of anyone, just that sound, that relentless, hollow bang. Clara pushed the door open with her foot, the rifle raised, her heart pounding against her ribs like a war drum. "Silas," she called, her voice echoing through the empty yard. Nothing, just wind, just silence, just that damn banging. Clara edged toward the barn, the mud sucking at her boots, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. When she reached the door, she shoved it open with one hand, rifle aimed, eyes darting. The barn was empty, just shadows and the scent of hay and horse sweat and old blood. Clara lowered the rifle, breath hitching in her chest, a scream clawing its way up her throat, and that's when she saw it. Silas's coat, hanging from a nail, stained with blood. "Silas!" she shouted, running forward, the world spinning, the ground lurching beneath her feet. The coat was still damp, the blood still warm. And when Clara yanked it down, a note fluttered to the ground, a single word scrawled in red ink. "Mine." Clara's stomach dropped, bile rising in her throat. This wasn't Silas's handwriting. This wasn't his blood. And before she could scream, a heavy hand clamped down over her mouth, yanking her back against a solid chest, a knife pressing into her throat. Well, well. A low voice purred in her ear, breath hot and stinking of whiskey. Looks like the widow's all alone. Clara's eyes widened, her pulse thundering, her fingers twitching against the rifle that lay just inches away. "Where is he?" she gasped, voice breaking. "What did you do to him?" The man chuckled, the blade biting into her skin. "You think you're special? You think that cowboy was going to save you? You're nothing, just a little wild rose plucked from the dirt." Clara's eyes darted to the corner, to the shovel leaning against the wall, to the gun just out of reach. She wasn't nothing. Not anymore. And if they thought she was just going to roll over and die like Thomas, they were dead wrong. "You think I'm nothing?" she whispered, voice shaking, eyes dark. The man snickered, pressing the knife harder against her throat. "That's right. A dead man's whore, a rich man's burden. Nothing." Clara closed her eyes, sucked in a breath, and then drove her elbow back as hard as she could, hearing the crunch of bone, feeling the man's grip loosen. The knife dropped. The rifle hit her hand, and when she swung it around, the barrel pressed against his forehead. She finally felt it. That fire, that fury, that ghost she'd been holding back since the day she'd buried Thomas. "I'm not nothing," she said, voice cold, eyes blazing. "I'm just getting started." The man's eyes bulged, sweat streaming down his face. The barrel of the rifle pressed so hard against his skull that the skin around it was turning white. Clara's finger trembled on the trigger, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts, every muscle in her body strung tight like a bow ready to snap. "Where is he?" she hissed, her voice sharp, venomous. The man swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Lady, you're making a mistake." "Where is Silas?" Clara jammed the rifle harder against his forehead, her jaw clenched, the taste of bile rising in her throat. "You think I'm scared to kill you? You think I won't blow your brains all over this barn?" The man's eyes darted left, right, like a trapped animal searching for a way out. "He's alive," he gasped, sweat dripping down his brow. "For now." "Where?" "The old mill," he said, voice shaking. "Boss said to make him watch while we take you." Clara's stomach clenched, nausea twisting through her, but she kept her face stone cold, eyes blazing. "How many?" "4, the man said, panting. "5 if you count the boss." Clara nodded, jaw set, eyes dark. "That all?" "Yeah, that's all. Please, don't." The butt of the rifle cracked against his temple, and he crumpled to the ground like a sack of flour, blood pooling beneath his head. Clara stepped back, chest heaving, the barn spinning around her, the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. They had Silas, and they were going to make him watch. Clara grabbed the rifle, reloaded it with shaking hands, then grabbed the knife off the ground, tucking it into her boot. The barn door slammed behind her, the wind howling through the valley as she sprinted across the yard toward the cabin. Inside, she tore through Silas's dresser, pulling out a box of bullets, stuffing them into her pockets, the weight of them heavy, reassuring. She strapped the pistol to her hip, grabbed a rope, and slung it over her shoulder. The old mill. That was a mile east, maybe less, and if they had Silas, then he was either dead or dying. Clara's jaw clenched, her chest burning with a fire that felt like it had been waiting to explode for years. She was done being a widow, done being a victim, done being the girl who cried in the night for a man who couldn't save her. This time, she was the one riding in, and they weren't going to see her coming. The wind howled as she hit the trail, mud splashing against her boots, the rifle heavy in her arms, the knife cold against her skin. The world blurred, the trees passing by like ghosts, the moon hanging high and full, a silent witness to what she was about to do. When the old mill loomed up ahead, dark and crumbling against the night sky, Clara dropped to her knees, panting, the air burning in her lungs. Voices echoed from inside, laughter, the clinking of bottles, the sound of men who thought they were untouchable. "You sure you don't want a taste first?" A man's voice drawled, lazy and smug. "Boss said she's his," another man replied. "But who's gonna know?" Clara's fingers tightened around the rifle. Her jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached. They were talking about her, and they didn't know she was listening. "Where's Boone?" the first man asked, voice slurring. "Out back," the other said. "Still hanging on by a thread." "Not for long," the first man said, chuckling. "Boss said to finish him before sunup." Clara's blood turned to ice. Silas was still alive. For now. Clara crept closer, eyes narrowed. Every step calculated. Silent. The world shrank down to a single point, a single moment, a single shot. She'd have to take them one by one. Fast, ruthless, no hesitation, no mercy. The old Clara would have hesitated. The old Clara would have cried. The old Clara was dead. Clara Evans was a ghost now, a ghost with a gun, and she was about to make them all pay. Clara crouched behind the rotting wood pile, the moon casting jagged shadows across the ground, her breath fogging up in short, sharp bursts. Inside the mill, the men laughed, their voices echoing through the hollow structure like the howls of wolves circling a wounded deer. Clara gripped the rifle, her knuckles white, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could see them through the gap in the wall. 4 men gathered around a barrel fire, the flames flickering against their filthy faces. And there he was. Silas Boone, slumped against a wooden post, his hands tied behind his back, his head hanging low, blood dripping from a gash above his brow. His shirt was torn, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. Clara's heart clenched, her teeth grinding together so hard she tasted blood. "You hear that, Boone?" one of the men said, grinning as he held up a half-empty bottle of whiskey. "Your little widow's about to learn what it means to really be a man's wife." The other men laughed, and Clara's nails bit into the wood, splinters slicing through her skin. "Bet she screams just like the last one," another man said, tossing a knife between his hands, the blade flashing in the firelight. "Boss said she was a pretty one. Shame you had to go and ruin her." Silas's head lifted, his eyes dark and burning, his jaw clenched so hard the muscle twitched beneath the skin. "You touch her," he rasped, voice low and deadly, "and I'll rip your goddamn heart out." The man with the knife grinned, crouching down to Silas's level, his breath reeking of rot and whiskey. "You ain't ripping nothing out, cowboy. You can't even stand." Clara felt the fire rise in her chest, the rage burning so hot she thought it might consume her whole. These men had taken everything from her, her husband, her home, her dignity. And now they were going to take the one man who had tried to save her. Not tonight, not ever. Clara tightened her grip on the rifle, her breath slowing, her pulse steadying. One shot. One man. Then move. The man with the knife raised it, the blade glinting in the firelight as he pressed it against Silas's cheek. "What do you think, Boone?" he said, voice slurring. "Think she'll cry for you or scream for me?" The rifle kicked back against Clara's shoulder, and the man's head snapped back, a crimson hole blossoming between his eyes. Silence. The other 3 men whipped around, eyes wide, mouths open, and Clara stepped out of the shadows, the rifle smoking in her hands. Her eyes dead and cold. "You boys looking for me?" she said, her voice as sharp as the blade in her boot. The man nearest her lunged forward, his knife flashing through the air, but Clara sidestepped, the barrel of the rifle catching him under the jaw with a sickening crunch. His body crumpled to the floor, and before the other 2 could react, Clara was already moving, the knife sliding from her boot, the blade slicing through the second man's throat in one clean, ruthless motion. Blood sprayed against the wall, the man gurgling, eyes wide as he collapsed to his knees, clutching at his neck. The last man was faster. He tackled Clara to the ground, the rifle clattering from her hands, his fist slamming into her jaw, pain exploding across her face. "You stupid bitch," he snarled, his breath hot against her skin, his hands wrapping around her throat, squeezing. Clara's vision blurred, her lungs screaming for air, her hands scrabbling against the dirt, searching for the knife, the gun, anything. And then she felt it. A rock. Cold. Heavy. Her fingers closed around it, and she swung it up, smashing it into the side of the man's head. He grunted, his grip loosening, and Clara swung again, harder, the sound of bone crunching beneath the impact. Blood poured down his face, his eyes rolling back in his skull, and Clara rolled him off her, gasping, the world spinning around her. She pushed herself to her feet, swaying, her legs trembling beneath her, and staggered toward Silas. His head hung low, blood dripping from his mouth, his breathing shallow and ragged. "Silas," Clara whispered, her hands fumbling with the ropes binding his wrists. "Wake up! Come on! Wake up!" Silas's eyes fluttered, his brow creasing, and he let out a low, pained groan. "Clara?" "Yeah," she said, tears streaming down her face, her fingers shaking as she cut through the rope. "I'm here! I'm right here!" The last rope snapped, and Silas slumped forward, his body heavy, collapsing into her arms. Clara held him tight, her face buried in his hair, her tears mingling with his blood. "It's over," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's over." But deep down, Clara knew it wasn't over. Not yet, because the man who sent them was still out there, and he was waiting for her. The sun was beginning to rise, casting long, blood-red shadows across the dirt as Clara half-carried, half-dragged Silas through the woods. His body was dead weight against her, his head lolling to the side, eyes half-closed, lips moving without sound. "Come on, stay with me," Clara panted, her legs shaking, her back screaming from the strain. "We're almost there." The cabin loomed up ahead, dark and empty. A broken shell of a home that no longer felt like a safe haven. Clara stumbled up the steps, kicked the door open, and dragged Silas inside, his boots scraping against the floorboards. She laid him down in front of the hearth, her hands trembling as she lit a match, the fire flaring up with a whoosh. "Silas," she said, slapping his cheek lightly, her heart hammering. "Come on, wake up." His eyelids fluttered, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. "Clara?" "I'm here," she said, pushing his hair back from his forehead, her fingers coming away sticky with blood. "I'm right here." Silas's hand fumbled for hers, his grip weak, his eyes dark and glassy. Did they hurt you?" Clara shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "No, not me, just you." Silas's jaw clenched, his body shuddering with pain, and Clara swallowed the scream clawing its way up her throat. "Stay still," she said, reaching for the bowl of water she'd set by the fire. "I need to clean you up." She dipped the rag in the water, wrung it out, and pressed it against the cut on his forehead. Silas sucked in a sharp breath, his fist clenching against the floor. "I'll kill them," he rasped, voice raw. "I swear to God, Clara, I'll kill them all." "They're already dead," Clara said, her voice flat, emotionless. "Except for one." Silas's eyes snapped open, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Who?" "The man who sent them," Clara said, her voice like ice. "The one who thinks he owns me." Silas's jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a fire that hadn't been there moments ago. "Talcott. He left a note," Clara said, pulling the crumpled paper from her pocket, the word "mine" scrawled across it in red ink. "He's not going to stop." "Then neither am I," Silas said, struggling to sit up, his teeth gritted against the pain. Clara pushed him back down, her eyes fierce, her heart slamming against her ribs. "You're in no shape to fight." "I can still hold a gun," Silas said, his gaze hard, unyielding. "I can still pull a trigger." Clara shook her head, her hands trembling as she pressed the rag against his bleeding side. "I won't let you die for me." "You think this is about you?" Silas said, his voice sharp, eyes blazing. "That man took everything from me, my land, my wife. Now he wants to take you too." "Then let me go," Clara said, her jaw set, her eyes dark. "Let me end this." Silas's hand shot out, grabbing her by the back of the neck, pulling her face close to his. You don't know what he's capable of." "I know what I'm capable of," Clara said, her breath hot against his cheek. "And I'm done being scared." Silas's eyes searched hers, his jaw working, his chest heaving. "Promise me you won't go after him alone." Clara swallowed, her throat tight. "I can't promise that." "Clara, you told me once to choose," Clara said, her voice shaking. "To choose between staying buried with Thomas or walking away. I chose to walk away. But this isn't about that anymore. This is about making sure that man never hurts anyone else again." Silas's grip loosened, his hand falling away, his eyes dark and haunted. "Then let me go with you. You can barely stand," Clara said, her voice soft, broken. "I can barely breathe without you," Silas said, his eyes glistening, his lips trembling. Clara pressed her forehead against his, her tears mingling with his blood. "Stay here," she whispered. "Let me do this. Let me end it." Silas's eyes closed, his chest rising and falling against hers, his breath hot against her skin. "Promise me," he said, his voice breaking. "Promise me you'll come back." Clara pulled away, her eyes hard, her jaw set, her hand slipping down to the knife strapped to her boot. "I promise," she said, her voice low and cold. "But if I don't, just know that I didn't die a widow. I died a fighter." Silas watched her go, his fists clenched, his jaw tight, the firelight flickering against his face as Clara stepped out into the night, the wind howling through the trees like a pack of hungry wolves. And somewhere out there, Talcott was waiting. But he wasn't the only one. The night was dark as pitch, the wind howling through the trees like a chorus of lost souls as Clara marched down the muddy path, rifles slung over her shoulder, knife strapped to her hip. The moon hung high and cold, a silver eye staring down on her as she approached the old Talcott ranch, the place where her life had been ripped apart and where it would either end or begin again. Talcott's men were out front, two of them leaning against the porch rail, cigars glowing like angry eyes in the dark. Clara crouched low, her breath fogging up in white puffs, her hands steady as she raised the rifle, lined up the sights, and squeezed the trigger. The first man's head snapped back. Blood sprang against the wall behind him. The second man scrambled for his gun, but Clara was already moving, her boots pounding against the dirt as she closed the distance, the rifle a dead weight in her hands. "Where is he?" she snarled, grabbing the man by the collar, shoving the barrel of the rifle under his jaw. The man's eyes bulged, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Inside," he choked, hands shaking. "He's waiting for you." Clara dropped him, kicked open the door, and stormed inside. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the hearth. Talcott sat in a chair by the fire, one leg crossed over the other, a glass of whiskey cradled in his hand. He smiled when he saw her, his teeth gleaming like a wolf's. "Well, well," he drawled, swirling the whiskey in the glass. "Look what the storm blew in." Clara aimed the rifle at his chest, her jaw clenched, eyes dark and blazing. "Where are they?" Talcott laughed, the sound low and dangerous, echoing through the empty house. "You mean the men you just shot? Or the man you left bleeding to death in your barn?" Clara's heart hammered, her hands shaking as she tightened her grip on the rifle. "You don't get to say his name." "Oh, Silas," Talcott said, smirking. "I remember him. Weak little man, wasn't he? Couldn't even protect his own wife." Clara pulled the trigger, the shot echoing like thunder as the glass in Talcott's hand exploded, whiskey and blood spraying across the floor. Talcott's hand shook, a shard of glass embedded in his palm, blood dripping onto the floorboards. "You bitch," he hissed, eyes narrowing. "You got guts, I'll give you that." Clara stepped closer, the rifle still aimed at his chest, her jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached. "You took everything from me. You took my husband. You took my home. You tried to take my life." Talcott smirked, wiping the blood from his palm, his eyes glinting like a snake's. "And you think you're going to take it back? A little widow with a big gun? Please." Clara cocked the rifle, her eyes blazing. "I'm not a widow anymore." Talcott's grin faded, his jaw tightening. "You're right," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You're just another whore who thinks she's a man." Clara's finger tightened on the trigger, her vision blurring with rage and pain and all the screams she'd swallowed down for so long. But before she could fire, the window behind Talcott shattered, glass exploding inward as a body crashed through, hitting the floor in a heap of blood and mud and fury. Silas Boone rose from the floor, a knife clenched in his fist, eyes dark and wild, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "You forgot about me," he rasped, his voice hoarse, his hand shaking as he advanced on Talcott. Talcott scrambled back, eyes wide, mouth open, his hands shaking as Silas loomed over him. "Please," Talcott gasped, hands raised. "I was just what?" Silas snarled, grabbing him by the collar, lifting him off the floor. "Just trying to kill me? Just trying to take my wife?" Talcott's eyes darted to Clara, desperation flashing across his face. "Clara, please," he said, voice trembling. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to." Clara stepped forward, the rifle lowering, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed. "You took everything from me," she said, her voice low and cold and steady. "Now I'm taking it back." Silas didn't give Talcott a chance to scream. The knife flashed, blood sprayed, and when it was over, Talcott lay crumpled on the floor, eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling, blood pooling beneath him like a crimson river. Silas dropped the knife, his chest heaving, his hands shaking as he turned to Clara. "You okay?" Clara's knees buckled, and she fell into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her face buried in his shoulder as the sobs finally came, crashing through her like a storm. "I thought I lost you," she whispered, her fingers digging into his hair. Silas held her tight, his breath warm against her ear. "You'll never lose me," he said, his voice breaking. "Not ever." Outside, the wind howled, the storm clouds parting as the first light of dawn spilled across the land. Inside, Clara and Silas stood in the wreckage, blood on their hands, tears on their faces, and for the first time they weren't haunted anymore. They were free,